Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating historical mystery, reconstructing the daily, lived reality of ordinary people in the Middle Ages. Beyond the smell of wood smoke and the toll of the village bell, we've all carried around this very specific image of the medieval world, right? We picture this grim, incredibly short-lived civilization where surviving past your youth was basically a miracle. But when we actually look closer, when we combine the rigor of academic history with archaeology and the actual demographic records of everyday peasants, a completely different human world emerges. So we're going to dismantle one of history's absolute most persistent misunderstandings and discover how our ancestors truly experienced aging, mortality, and survival.
Okay, let's dive right into this. If you've ever heard that everyone just dropped dead by their 30th birthday in the medieval era, we really have to ask ourselves, well, where are all the old people in our historical records? Because when we actually read medieval texts, or look at court records, or study the archaeology of village cemeteries, we find communities literally filled with elders. We see 50-year-old farmers, 60-year-old priests, and grandmothers helping to raise the next generation. Now, if the 30-year limit was a real biological thing, these people simply shouldn't exist. So how did this myth get started in the first place, and why on earth is it so incredibly pervasive today?
Well, the myth actually comes from a very real, very accurate demographic statistic. It is absolutely true that life expectancy at birth in 13th and 14th century Europe hovered right around 25 to 35 years. But while this widely cited statistic creates super powerful modern myth, what's really going on here is that a simple mathematical average is completely obscuring the true human experience of our ancestors. It basically takes the deeply complex, often tragic reality of medieval life and flattens it into a single number that tricks us into believing 30 was some sort of biological finish line for an aging body.
To figure out what was actually happening, we have to look at the age structure of the population. By modern standards, medieval England was shockingly young. Half of all people in the 14th century were just 21 years old or younger. Think about that for a second. If you lined up the entire population of England from youngest to oldest, the person standing right in the absolute middle would barely be an adult by our standards today. This radically shaped the energy and burden of society. It was literally a civilization carried on the shoulders of the very young. But, and this is absolutely crucial, this youthful society wasn't because adults were dying of old age in their 30s. It was the direct outcome of a staggering, relentless mortality rate at the very beginning of life.
Historians and demographic experts actually call this 30-year life expectancy a meaningless mean. And they call it that because it wasn't a biological limit on aging at all. Instead, it was an illusion created by a devastating demographic bottleneck. You see, averages are incredibly sensitive to extremes. When you have a massive clustering of deaths at age 0, 1, and 2, it acts like this massive gravitational weight. It drags the statistical average down so far that it completely misrepresents the lifespan of anyone who actually managed to survive childhood.
And this brilliantly illustrates the reality of how the math actually works. Let's look at this hypothetical cohort of 10 medieval individuals, which is based on actual historical modeling. Now, if 4 out of 10 children succumb to extreme infant mortality, dying at ages 1, 2, and 3, but the other 6 survive those perilous early years and live into their 40s, 60s, and even 70s, the mathematical average of all 10 lives artificially plummets down to the early 30s. In this exact group, not a single person actually died at age 32, yet mathematically, that is their average life expectancy. Crazy, right?
The sheer scale of this early mortality is honestly difficult for us to fully grasp today. Up to 30% of infants perished before their very first birthday, and another 10 to 20% died before reaching age 15. The psychological toll of this was just immense. It required incredible emotional resilience from medieval families who had to endure the agonizing uncertainty of this infant mortality rate. And, they didn't love their children any less just because death was common. Quite the opposite. Everyday survival was a fierce, protective struggle against microscopic threats in the water they drank and the air they breathed, literal dangers they couldn't even see, let alone fully understand.
Section 1. Surviving the bottleneck, the lived reality of adulthood.
So, what actually happened to those who managed to survive the biological bottleneck of youth? Well, the records from medieval manorial courts tell a really remarkable story of human endurance. If a peasant survived the gauntlet of early childhood diseases to reach their mid-20s, they had a very, very high chance of living well into their 50s, 60s, or beyond. An English yeoman farmer who celebrated his 25th birthday could statistically expect another 25 years of life. They were fully expected to grow into elders, accumulate wisdom, guide their families, and really maintain that complex social fabric of their local villages for decades to come. Of course, adulthood wasn't a breeze. It carried constant sensory terrors that could truncate those years at any given moment. You had the sudden mass mortality of the Black Death, which wiped out up to half the population. There were untreated infections from simple farming machinery, like a miller getting caught in a gear or a smith burned at the forge. And there were just tragic freak accidents, like the deeply human story of Maud Phrase, who was killed by a falling castle stone back in 1288. Without antibiotics, every single day required careful, deliberate navigation of a highly physical world, where a simple cut from a rusted plow or a kick from a horse could easily be a death sentence.
Section 2. The Urban Graveyard: Deadly Cities versus Rural Survival.
It turns out where you lived drastically altered your chances of growing old. Medieval cities were basically demographic sinks. Industrial runoff from tanneries, primitive waste disposal, and cramped tenements in cities like early 15th century Florence created environments so infectious they dragged life expectancy below 30. Urban mortality consistently exceeded fertility. This meant cities literally consumed human lives, and they only sustained their populations by constantly drawing in new migrants from the rural villages, where the fresh air and open space offered comparatively much better statistical odds of survival.
What is absolutely heartbreaking when we look at the bioarchaeological evidence is the female-specific penalty of these cities. Young rural women migrating to places like London for labor faced devastatingly elevated mortality rates. They were leaving the relatively safer countryside to work in dense, highly unhygienic urban environments. This exposed them to novel pathogens to which they totally lacked prior immunity. The men's survival risk remained relatively equal in both environments, but for a young woman seeking a better life in the city, the urban environment was uniquely lethal.
Section 3. The Wealth of Years: Class, Diet, and Longevity.
Now we also have to ask how the social hierarchy shaped survival. Notice how our recurring number 30 makes another appearance here. Based on records from the Halesowen Manor in the 14th century, 30 years wasn't the lifespan of the average person, but rather the grim reality specifically for destitute cottagers. Their total lack of grain reserves left them starving. This physically immunosuppressed their bodies, making them prime targets for endemic diseases. Meanwhile, well-off peasants with secure food supplies easily averaged 50 years of age. It perfectly illustrates how caloric security was, in a lot of ways, the ultimate medieval medicine.
Conversely, if we look all the way at the very top of the social ladder, an adult noble surviving past 21 could easily reach 64, and popes frequently lived into their 60s. But elite families still faced brutal early mortality. For elite men, the expectation of battlefield violence meant English kings averaged only 52 years, often dying from war or political assassination. And for elite women, regardless of their stone castles or rich diets, they still faced the incredible, inescapable dangers of pre-modern childbirth. Wealth definitely changed your cause of death, but it couldn't shield you from the fundamental vulnerabilities of the human condition.
Ironically, retreating from the world entirely didn't always save you either. Monks living in seemingly safe, stone-walled abbeys sometimes suffered much worse survival rates than hardworking peasants out in the fields. In one late medieval Carmelite abbey, only 5% of monks survived past age 45. Just 5%. Their intensely crowded communal living conditions meant that once a disease actually entered the monastery, it spread like wildfire through the damp, enclosed cloisters, decimating communities that possessed very limited pathogen resistance. Everyday survival was a constant, deliberate navigation of these environmental pressures. It really wasn't a passive wait for death. It was an active, daily fight for life. Wealthy elites followed 14th century physician orders to arrive fasting and shave before soaking in alpine baths to purge bodily impurities. Soldiers literally dragged portable bathtubs on military campaigns just for basic hygiene. Meanwhile, ordinary people were out there desperately trying to secure grain to prevent famine-induced immunosuppression and fleeing the toxic industrial runoff of the cities. They fought for their health using absolutely every tool their civilization possessed.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought. When we simply dismiss the medieval past as a time when everyone just died at 30, we totally erase the incredible resilience, the psychological endurance, and the civilizational survival of ordinary people. They loved, worked, fought, and aged much like we do, within a world that was undeniably harsher but entirely human. We really do a disservice to their memory by flattening their vibrant, lifelong struggles into a single, misunderstood statistic. So the next time you picture the medieval world, don't just see a young, tragic society, picture the resilient elders who guided it through the storm. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. The past wasn't just a place of early death, it was a profound testament to the endurance of life. So what other historical myths are we taking for granted? Keep questioning the history you think you know.